Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, October 3rd, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, the U.S. is running out of money to replace arms sent to Ukraine. So the Pentagon has warned Congress that it's running out of money to replace stockpiles of weapons that have been sent to Ukraine. And the Pentagon also said that it was forced to slow down the replenishment of the U.S. military, which really shows how many resources they have been pouring into this proxy war. So this warning comes after Congress passed a short-term funding bill to avert a government shutdown that did not include money to continue fueling the war in Ukraine. According to AP, Pentagon Comptroller Michael McCord told House and Senate leaders that the U.S. military has $1.6 billion left of the $25.9 billion that Congress has authorized to replace weapons poured into Ukraine. So McCord said, quote, "We have already been forced to slow down the replenishment of our own forces to hedge against an uncertain funding future. Failure to replenish our military services on a timely basis could harm our military's readiness," end quote. So that's a pretty serious thing the Pentagon is saying. This could just be an effort to pressure Congress to pass this new Ukraine funding quicker. But still, again, I think it really shows just the amount of weapons and money that they've been putting into this war in Ukraine. So the Pentagon also has about $5.4 billion remaining in presidential drawdown authority, and that is what allows President Biden to send weapons to Ukraine directly from military stockpiles. So this is the different ways the money is spent, the various types of funding that goes toward this war. You have the money that pays for the weapons going to Ukraine, and then there's also money paying for the Pentagon to replenish those stockpiles. So just different ways that they're spending here. And this $5.4 billion that the Pentagon has left, that was made available. That's part of the $6.2 billion. That's what's left of the $6.2 billion that was made available by what the Pentagon called an accounting error. They said that they found out they overvalued weapons that they sent to Ukraine previously, and they said, oh, look, we got another $6.2 billion to work with. I mean, it's just a huge amount of money to, chalk up to an accounting error. I think it shows that they're going to find money to keep funding this war no matter what. So McCord said that the Pentagon is completely out of funds for the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which allows the Biden administration to purchase weapons for Ukraine, and that's meant for more long-term support. But the U.S. has doled out a lot of money under that initiative. And McCord said that without new funding for the war soon, the Pentagon will be forced to restrict the type of arms being sent to Ukraine that he said are critical and urgent now as Russia prepares to conduct a winter offensive. So interesting that the Pentagon is saying they're expecting a Russian offensive now this winter, that Ukraine's counteroffensive has failed. So the White House has asked Congress to authorize an additional, they're looking for $24 billion to spend on this war, and that would bring total spending on the conflict, U.S. spending on the conflict, to about $137 billion. So that's a lot of money. And the next story here, Representative Matt Gaetz files to oust Speaker McCarthy amid Ukraine aid questions. So this is pretty big news that happened on Monday night. Representative Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida, filed a resolution to oust House Speaker Kevin McCarthy after questioning if the House GOP leader cut a secret deal with the White House on Ukraine aid. So a motion to vacate the speakership is considered a privileged resolution, giving it priority over other issues. McCarthy has 2 legislative days to schedule the resolution for a vote, but there are procedural mechanisms that he could use, that his supporters in the House could use to delay the vote, and there's ways they could potentially block it. I believe they could have a vote to kill the Gaetz resolution if he thinks he could get enough support for that. But this resolution to oust McCarthy, they would only need a simple majority. And since a handful of House Republicans have signaled that they would vote yes on the motion, that means McCarthy is going to need support from some Democrats if he's going to survive this. And no House Speaker has ever been removed through a motion to vacate. So if it does happen, it will be a pretty historical event here. And I think it's good to see this happening, McCarthy being threatened to lose his speakership essentially over Ukraine because Gaetz believes that he cut some kind of deal with Biden. And Gaetz is very opposed to the war in Ukraine, to the U.S. supporting this proxy war. So, the majority of Congress still favors spending. If this new Ukraine aid comes for a vote, it's going to pass. That's the reality. But I think this shows that this opposition is growing, and the opposition does have some power, significant power, if he could do something like this. So a few hours before Gaetz filed this motion, he delivered a speech on the House floor questioning if McCarthy did make a secret deal with Biden. McCarthy has denied that he made any kind of side deal, but President Biden did say on Sunday that he expects McCarthy to keep his word and secure the passage of support for Ukraine. So that kind of signals some kind of deal was made, or, some kind of arrangement might have been made here. Because again, this temporary funding bill that Congress passed over the weekend and that President Biden signed into law on Saturday night, that funds the government until November 17th. Biden wanted Ukraine money in there, and it was taken out, but Biden still signed it into law. So, maybe, there might have been some kind of thing here. Say, we passed this, you sign it, and then I'll bring this Ukraine aid to the floor for a vote, soon, maybe as soon as this week. But now this, they're going to have to deal with what Gaetz did here. All right, so the next one, the White House says that the U.S. will send more weapons to Ukraine soon. So the White House said Monday that the U.S. will be sending another weapons package to Ukraine soon to show continued support for the war after Congress did not include that Ukraine aid in the short-term funding bill. So that's what a lot of these stories are about. That's what's been in the news. Everybody's freaking out about how the Ukraine aid was not included in that funding bill. So White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said, quote, "There is a strong, very international coalition behind Ukraine, and if Putin thinks he can outlast us, he's wrong. And so we will have another package of aid for Ukraine soon to signal our continued support for the brave people of Ukraine," end quote. So remember, the Pentagon still has $5.4 billion to work with to send weapons to Ukraine. The last weapons package that the U.S. provided Ukraine was announced on September 21st when Zelensky was in Washington. President Biden announced it when he met with him, and that was worth $325 million, and it included the second tranche of civilian-killing cluster bombs. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. still has, still has the $5.4 billion that they could work with. So the White House did not say what might be included in this next aid package. I'm kind of fearing the worst here. There were these recent media reports that said President Biden has agreed to arm Ukraine with Army tactical missile systems. Those are the ATACMS, and those are missiles, artillery munitions that can be fired from the HIMARS rocket systems. They have a range of up to 190 miles, which would be a huge escalation of U.S. support for Ukraine. Most of the ammunition they've been giving Ukraine to use with those HIMARS has a range of 50 miles, so this is almost 4 times the range. And these reports also said that Biden has decided to send a cluster bomb variant of the ATACMS to Ukraine. So that means, these ATACMS would give Ukraine the ability to use the HIMARS to hit targets in Russian territory and possibly deep in Crimea. So this means that, the U.S. might be giving Ukraine the ability to launch cluster bombs into Russian territory. And cluster bombs leave behind, what they do is they scatter small submunitions over a large area. That's what they're designed to do. So little bombs that will explode, but many of them don't explode, and they can be found years or even decades later by civilians, usually children in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They're still finding them today. Thousands of people have been killed in those countries after the war in Vietnam because of all the cluster bombs that the U.S. left behind, and they're still cleaning them up. They still have a lot more cleanup to do, especially in Laos. It's something like they've only cleaned up 1% of the cluster bombs that were dropped there. So it's just something, we always try to put the shoe on the other foot when we're talking about this issue. How would the U.S. feel if Russia was funding a war on its border and gave some, Mexico or something the ability to launch cluster bombs into U.S. territory? I mean, we can't even fathom a situation like that. That's how far we are here. We never thought we would get to this point of these crazy escalations, but here we are. Hopefully, that they don't announce those ATACMS in the next aid package. My point in that article was just to say that is a possibility, but hopefully, I don't know, cooler heads or more sane heads in the Biden administration decide not to send those things. All right, so the next one here, Russia expects the U.S. to continue Ukraine support. So this is interesting. Russian officials on Monday downplayed the impact of Congress passing a short-term funding bill over the weekend that did not include funds to spend on supporting Ukraine. They said that the U.S. will find the money. This is Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov. He said, quote, "They will continue their support. We should not think that something is about to change. It's just grandstand play. It's codswallop," end quote, which codswallop I know is like British slang for nonsense. That's the translation, from Russian state media. So Ryabkov added that the U.S.'s focus on supporting its stooges in Ukraine would not change. He said, quote, "Inter-party squabbles have nothing to do with support. They will find the money," end quote. So Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, he made similar comments saying that the U.S. will continue its involvement in the conflict. But he also said that he believes it's a sign and that there will be growing exhaustion in the West when it comes to continuing to support this war. So officials in Kiev also downplayed the events in Congress. Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba said, quote, We had a very in-depth discussion with both parts of Congress, Republicans and Democrats, and against the background of a potential shutdown in the United States, the decision was taken as it was," end quote. And he added that he does not feel that U.S. support has been shattered, and he said that Ukraine is working with Congress to make sure that it does not happen again under any circumstances, he said. So kind of forceful words from Ukraine about what they want Congress to do. But Russia and Ukraine on the same page there. They don't think that this means the U.S. support for the war is going to be ending anytime soon. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. views corruption in Ukraine as a major threat. So a leaked U.S. government strategy shows that the Biden administration is far more concerned about corruption in Ukraine than it's publicly letting on. And this was reported by Politico on Monday. So the State Department quietly released a 22-page public version of an integrated country strategy for Ukraine that makes clear corruption is a major concern for the U.S. So the strategy outlines long-term goals for U.S. policy in Ukraine with an emphasis on rooting out corruption. So this document, and again, this is the public version, one line says, quote, "Ukraine must slay the corruption dragon once and for all," end quote. So according to Politico, the confidential version of the strategy that was not released to the public is 3 times as long and uses even stronger language when discussing Ukraine's corruption. It says, quote, "Perceptions of high-level corruption undermine the Ukrainian public's and foreign leaders' confidence in the wartime government," end quote. So Ukraine has been notorious for its corruption for a very long time, but the U.S. has sought to downplay the issue as it has poured tens of billions of dollars in weapons and economic aid into Ukraine since the Russian invasion. But recent corruption scandals have brought Ukrainian graft back into the news and resulted in mass firings, including Zelensky's recent sacking of his defense minister and 6 deputy defense ministers. They all got fired, all the deputy defense ministers. And the defense ministry was accused of overseeing, purchases at inflated prices and things like that. So a U.S. official speaking to Politico acknowledged that there are some honest conversations happening behind the scenes regarding Ukraine's corruption. Another U.S. official said that the Biden administration was discussing with Ukrainian officials the idea of potentially conditioning future economic aid on reforms to tackle corruption. So conditioning the economic assistance on, them cracking down on corruption. But the official said that the idea of conditioning military aid is not being discussed because the administration is determined to keep this war going no matter what the risks are or what the costs. So other long-term goals for Ukraine outlined in the strategy include Ukraine's military adopting NATO standards, establishing a domestic defense industry in Ukraine, and the strategy also calls for the creation of a national-level resistance plan, which could mean the U.S., it sounds like the U.S. supporting something like an insurgency if Russia gains more territory in Ukraine. All right, so the next one here, decades-old U.S. Marshall Islands Pact lapses. So a long-standing agreement that gives the U.S. military access to the Marshall Islands in exchange for financial aid and other benefits expired on September 30th. This was reported by the South China Morning Post. And they quoted someone named Cleo Pascal, who's a fellow at the Hawkish Foundation for the Defense of Democracy's think tank. And this person claimed that what just expired with the Marshall Islands was the financial and federal service component, while the defense right continues. So that signals that just because this expired does not mean that the U.S. has to give up its military presence in the Marshall Islands. But there's still negotiations going on. So this agreement that the U.S. has with the Marshall Islands, it's called the Compact of Free Association, abbreviated as COFA. And the U.S. has that they had it with the Marshall Islands. Now it's expired, but they also have COFAs with Micronesia and Palau. But the Biden administration was able to negotiate a renewal of those deals with those 2 Pacific Island nations. The issue with the Marshall Islands is that they want more compensation and an apology for the 67 nuclear weapons tests that the U.S. conducted on its territory between 1946 and 1958. Huge tests. They blew up tons of bombs on the surface above the Marshall Islands, including Castle Bravo, which was the largest nuclear weapons test ever done. And, radioactive fallout, basically snowed down on people living in nearby atolls. And they were actually told to go back to areas where they knew there was radiation. There's a quote from a U.S. atomic energy official basically saying, we want to see what the effects of radiation will do to people, so let's send them back. And, I believe the quote was something like, they're certainly not civilized like we are, but they are, I guess, more than mice was how they put it. But they looked at these people as, lab rats for how radiation would affect people. And I linked to my article that goes into more detail on that in here if you want to go check that out. More about the horrors of the nuclear tests here. But the fact that this agreement has lapsed is notable, although it looks like the negotiations are still going on. And a delegate to the U.S. House for American Samoa told Voice of America that negotiators are hoping to reach an agreement this month. So according to Howard Hills, who was previously a member of the U.S. negotiating team, the only holdup is that the State Department's legal view of the nuclear funds is that the U.S. paid a $150 million settlement to the Marshall Islands in 1986. And the State Department said that was a full settlement of all the claims related to nuclear testing. So that means they can't give any more. And even though that $150 million fell well short of what's needed to clean up all the radioactive debris that the U.S. left behind. The State Department will not let any funds be designated for that purpose. So if I'm understanding what this guy is saying, he says the U.S. is willing to give more money, but they're not going to say that it's for the nuclear testing, and they're probably not willing to give any kind of apology. So we'll see how this plays out. But the U.S. views these agreements with the Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau as key to their strategy against China in the region, because not only does it allow military access, but how the U.S. interprets these agreements is that it gives them the ability to deny other countries' militaries from entering this territory. And not only their territory, also their exclusive economic zones, which is an area defined by the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea as an area that extends 200 miles from a country's coast, and that country has the rights to resources in those waters. But according to this international law, they can't do things like deny, other countries from sailing in those areas. So I hope this isn't too wonky, but I think it's worth pointing out because that's what the U.S. wants to do with these agreements. And by having, total control over their exclusive economic zones, it gives the U.S. a huge portion of the Pacific that China can't enter, that the U.S. would maybe take action to prevent them from entering. Now, this United Nations treaty, abbreviated as UNCLOS, which defines international law when it comes to maritime stuff like this. The U.S. never ratified the treaty, so is not technically a party to the treaty. So you could say, why would the U.S. have to follow UNCLOS? But they use UNCLOS to reject China's claims to the South China Sea. So they, it's just an example of the U.S. picking and choosing when international law suits their interests, and when it doesn't, they don't worry about it. That's just the reality. But again, this is just a big part of the U.S. military buildup in the Pacific. They want to maintain these areas, and they want to increase their military presence in these Pacific Island nations. All right, so the next one here, Taiwan's ex-leader vows to boycott a double 10th event over Taiwan independence. So this is interesting. So the former president of Taiwan, who was president from 2008 to 2016, Ma Ying-jeou, has vowed to boycott the double 10th public holiday over what he said was the ruling Democratic Progressive Party government's scheme to promote independence for the island. He also urged the DPP government in January's presidential elections. He urged voters to remove the DPP government. So essentially what this is about is that the double 10th holiday in Taiwan, celebrated on October 10, it marks the start of the 1911 revolution that ended the Qing dynasty in China and led to the founding of the Republic of China. The event has continued to be celebrated in Taiwan since the Kuomintang or nationalists fled to the island following their defeat by the communists in the Chinese Civil War in 1949. So the Kuomintang consider Taiwan to be the Republic of China. It's still their official name, but Taiwan's ruling party, the Democratic Progressive Party, they're more independence-leaning, and they are calling it Taiwan National Day, and they're using a logo that calls it that. So I just thought this was worth pointing out because it shows how a lot of people in Taiwan, including the Kuomintang, which is the main opposition party, that is Ma's party, and when he was president, tensions were a lot cooler with China. They consider Taiwan still to be the Republic of China and not an independent nation with the name of Taiwan. And that's not the official policy of the current Taiwanese government ruled by the DPP. But they do say, we're a de facto independent country, that we operate as an independent country. And then the main opposition party still believes that it's the Republic of China. So, it's just something worth pointing out because a lot of people don't understand that. It's not just China who says Taiwan is China. It's a lot of people in Taiwan say Taiwan is China. Anyway, the next one here. This article is from Kyle Anzalone. The UN Security Council okays sending a force to Haiti. So the UN Security Council voted on this U.S.-backed Kenyan intervention in Haiti on Monday, and the motion passed. So they're going to send an international force into Haiti despite the fact that many Haitians, most Haitians, as I understand it, are against foreign intervention, even though the situation in Haiti is pretty bad with a lot of violence on the streets. So during this UN Security Council meeting, so the big question was Russia or China going to veto this motion? And they did not veto it. They abstained from voting. So they're saying that they're not supporting it, but they're not against it because the government has asked for the intervention. And the government of Haiti is led by Ariel Henry, and he rose to power with U.S. support after President Jovenel Moïse was assassinated in 2021. So Moïse was killed, and Henry became he's really the acting prime minister of Haiti. So he was never elected. So when you hear about Haiti, you hear about, this gang violence that's going on. They're saying all these gangs are taking over. But there's also been an uprising against the Henry government because he's unelected, and that's not just groups of violent gangs. It's also just ordinary Haitians that don't like this government. And there's a very dark legacy of foreign intervention in Haiti, as Kyle mentions here. The last UN mission to Haiti lasted from 2004 to 2017, and during that time, the troops committed sexual abuses against women, including underage women, and nearly 10,000 Haitians were killed by causing the UN peacekeepers caused a cholera outbreak. So things like that, and of course, foreign intervention in Haiti goes back much further than that. But it looks like this thing is a go, and this mission is going to be entirely funded by the U.S. They're putting up $100 million for it. They're increasing military ties with Kenya. The U.S. just didn't want to lead it itself. All right, so the last one here is another one from Kyle. Venezuela's Juan Guaido lands a job at a Florida college. So Juan Guaido, who was in 2019 declared himself president of Venezuela, and he received the full backing of the U.S., the EU, most of the West, who decided that Maduro was not president anymore, and they backed Guaido in a failed coup attempt. This was all during the Trump administration, and it failed pretty miserably. He never really gained any popular support. And in 2022, the opposition dissolved this so-called interim government that he was declared the president of, and he was, he's not the leader of this alternative government that never really had any power. They didn't have any power in Venezuela, but the U.S. and the EU gave this government, access to Venezuela's offshore money and funds. So I'm sure, they've done some things with it. But Guaido is now working at Florida International University to give a series of talks and mentor students. And he's going to be paid $40,000 for the fall semester. So he landed a nice, cushy lecturing gig at Florida University, after being the U.S.-backed coup leader in his country. All right, so that's it for the news for today. Please go check out our Viewpoints. We have one from Ted Galen Carpenter. Contempt for press freedoms. U.S. officials bar Tucker Carlson from interviewing Putin. One from Connor Freeman. As General Milley retires, his legacy is brinkmanship with Russia and China. So this article, General Milley is out. His replacement, Charles C.Q. Brown, is in as the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top general in the U.S. military, in charge of the U.S. military. And Connor reflects on Milley's legacy, and, it's different than the typical political partisan stuff that you'll see about him and Trump. It's more so about how he oversaw, this shift toward what they call great power competition, the shift away from counterterrorism in the Middle East towards these new Cold Wars with Russia and China. And that's really been the focus. These things have been brewing for a long time, of course, especially with Russia and Ukraine. But it's become the main focus of the U.S. military is Russia, especially now the proxy war in Ukraine and building up against China in the Asia Pacific. One from Sean Fleetwood. Washington funds Ukraine forever war while our soldiers' barracks rot. One from Brad Pierce. The international community is set to invade Haiti again. That's over at his Substack. And the spotlight is from Sarah Lee Whitson. 5 years after Khashoggi's murder, MBS is laughing. But that is everything for me. You could always support us by sharing the show, telling your friends about antiwar.com. I appreciate all the comments and stuff on YouTube, and follow us on social media. I'm on Twitter, or X as it's known now, at DeCampDave. Again, I appreciate everything, all the feedback, emails and stuff. You know, if you ever have any theories or anything you want to share about these wars that I cover, please let me know. But yeah, that's it. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.